Welcome back to the Law Beneath the Waves. In the second part of a series on the scientific challenges of deep sea mining, we go beneath the surface, literally, to look at the science behind the seabed. Today's conversation is about how we study the deep ocean, how knowledge is built through exploration and research, and what that actually tells us about deep sea ecosystem, their biodiversity, their structure, but also how they work. It's also about understanding environmental impacts in a very concrete way from the very first exploration activities. What have we learned so far, and how do scientists approach the challenges of anticipating impacts, including through tools like test mining? At the same time, this is a field where science is constantly evolving. Question of data, baseline, quality, standardization, but also, of course, interpretation are central. So this is a shift from describing ecosystems to really understanding how they function and what that means when decisions have to be made. And there's, of course, one of the most difficult challenges, restoration. If deep sea environments are impacted, do we actually have the tools and knowledge to restore them? And if not, what does it mean in practice? Well, we're going to explore all of these questions, and I'm joined today by my guest, Malcom Clark. Let's dive in. So welcome to a new episode of The Law Beneath the Waves. Today, I'm very, very happy to have the pleasure to have with us Malcom Clark, an emeritus scientist specialized in deep sea biodiversity habitats. Malcom, it's a pleasure to have you today. We're going to conduct the second part of the scientific challenges of deep sea mining. The first part was conducted by your colleague, Walter Rost. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Virginie, for the opportunity to explain some of the aspects that we've dealt with that we've covered in the book.
Thank you. You're welcome. So your specific contribution in the chapter that was very rich, and it was actually the chapter opening the book, so it was a very important chapter. With Walter, we actually covered the knowledge that was more related to mineral resources, techniques of exploration, exploitation, bathymetry, resource estimation, but a very important part of the chapter is also dedicated to environmental challenges. And so we really wanted to dig a bit more actually in these aspects. So it's what we're going to do today. So Malcom, in your career, you've been actually, as I mentioned, specialized in deep sea biodiversity habitats, and you've been working on stock assessments of deep water fish and conducting description of deep sea habitats and assessment of ecological risk from fishing to mining. You're sitting within the legal and technical commission of the International Seabed Authority, so you're really at the heart of all of these debates we have about knowledge of the deep sea beds, more specifically beyond national jurisdiction. And so in your chapter, you raise very important points about the environmental challenges. So what I suggest is actually to go through the very long list of questions that I've prepared with you. And maybe what we can start with will be actually for the audience to understand, is there actually a lot of research and exploration on the seabed beyond national jurisdiction? So when I talk about beyond national jurisdiction, it's basically in the middle of the ocean. It could be Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. Where are we in terms of research and exploration of the seabed, Malcom?
Right, thanks, Virginie. Yeah, the exploration of the offshore part of our oceans really dates back to the 1970s as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was being finalised, because that suddenly gave nations who previously had just been concerned with their immediate coastal waters both the opportunity and the responsibility to manage their resources out to 200 nautical miles from their coastlines. So that really sparked a new era of exploration, going out to 200 nautical miles under national jurisdiction and then beyond into what we call the area. And that's directly related to UNCLOS, and it is for the purposes of both non-living and living resources. So initially it was driven by fisheries, which were already occurring in the deep sea, but it really led to this increase in interest in what the geological resources, the mineral resources in these deeper waters might consist of, and what could be useful for our use.
Very interesting. And do you think actually, as of today, we have more knowledge about the seabed closer to the shores within national jurisdiction, or beyond national jurisdiction, where, for example, exploration activities are conducted in the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean?
Undoubtedly, we still know a great deal more about near coastal waters. The accessibility of shallower coastal waters to actually undertake research, combined with the national requirements to manage the impacts that humans are having, that's most pronounced on coastal waters. So there's very naturally there has been a focus on coastal waters. But that's, having said that, the increase in our knowledge of deep sea biology has increased dramatically in the last 20, 25 years. And that has been largely associated with the requirements of minerals exploration contractors to undertake research on the environment, to understand the baseline conditions, because an important part of any development of exploitation is understanding what the impacts caused by that exploitation compared with what impacts occur naturally. So there's that need to separate natural and human-induced impact and change. So understanding the baseline environmental conditions before any exploitation starts is a very important part of any application to utilise fisheries, or in our case, the focus on seabed minerals.
Yes, indeed. And basically, how much do we know about deep sea ecosystems? So there's a lot of different type of fauna that you actually describe in the chapter, and their specificities. I think it's interesting for the audience to understand that we talked about it with Walter, the mechanism of extension of the continental shelf, where you can have deep sea environments that could actually fall within the area or within national jurisdiction, depending on where you actually put the limits of national jurisdiction. So sometimes you have habitats that are actually could be the same beyond national jurisdiction or within national jurisdiction. What are the specificities of these ecosystems, actually, of the deep sea?
Deep sea and the marine environment is really not much different from on land. When you look out a window, we've got harbours, we've got coastal exposed surf beaches, we've got hills and mountains, we've got the sky. Deep ocean it might seem simpler because we don't see it, but it's just as complex. And without getting into details, but you have mentioned that, as Walter alluded to, the biology associated with each of the mineral resources is quite different, and that's only to be expected given the oceans are a vast open space. They've got the full range of geological formations, from seamounts and large mountain ranges through to abyssal plain areas. You've got the water column several kilometres deep. You've got this open water column which can extend for thousands and thousands of kilometres in horizontal space. You've got the water currents. You've got biology on top of the seabed, in the seabed. There's a very large array of habitat types and hence biology that is adapted to those particular conditions. And that's really quite important to bear in mind, that the deep sea has been around for millions, billions of years, and animals have adapted to, in many cases, a quite specific set of environmental characteristics. So that's why we've got animals which can cope with hydrothermal vent environments associated with seafloor massive sulfides. They can handle the the toxic chemical mix, which is lethal to a lot of animals.
Yeah, the chimneys. Oh, don't know the yes.
That's right, and they can cope with elevated temperatures. They can't survive in 300 to 400 degrees, but getting close to 100 degrees Celsius, some animals can survive, especially the bacteria. And you've got animals similarly adapted to live on the seafloor polymetallic nodules at 4 or 5 kilometres depth. Those nodules they've developed over millions of years, and so too have the small life forms that are associated with them. So the deep sea has a vast array of habitat types and fauna that is adapted to cope with the cold, the dark, the high pressure environment that they live in.
Yeah, a lot of extraordinary creatures we actually discover, and we see often, new discoveries with beautiful pictures of, how they could look like. It's really a magical place. Yeah, super interesting.
Although the vast majority of deep sea production, deep sea biodiversity, is not in fact visible. It's under the sediment. It's living in the sediment, so it's not visible to cameras. That diversity only becomes evident when you sample into the sediment itself below the seafloor.
I can imagine. Yes. Can you? And it will be more like a question out of curiosity for myself, because you talked about the sulfides, the chimneys. I know there are active chimneys and non-active chimneys, and I imagine the biodiversity around them is quite different and could actually, let's say, mining activities could have more impact on active chimneys than on passive chimneys. Maybe you could explain a bit the differences of this type of environments to people who don't know much actually about these chimneys.
Okay, well the chimneys are formed by effectively small volcanic type eruptions. So it's an active part of where the seafloor is spreading at the junction of tectonic plates. So this is where the hot, rich gases from inside the Earth are released as the seafloor slowly grows in parts of the ocean versus being consumed in other parts of the ocean. So where that spreading is active, that's where you get these hydrothermal vent environments. And these are these small volcanic type structures. The water being released is very hot, several hundred degrees Celsius, and it's very rich in chemicals which are coming up, being pulled up from the inside of the Earth, basically, and they're in solution. And the importance of those vents for seafloor massive sulfide development is that this very mineral and metal-rich cocktail, if you like, of water being extruded from inside the Earth, it hits the cold water of the surrounding ocean and it settles out. So these minerals can become quite rich and dense in the metal concentration, very close to the surface. What's important is that over time, as the seafloor spreads, the areas of those previous chimney environments and where the metals were settling out move away from the actual hotspot. And as they cool, they become much more like a normal seamount type environment, an inactive one. And that's where, as you noted, the fauna is different. It doesn't now need to be adapted any longer to strong chemical mix or the temperature. And they are the resources that are actually of most interest to miners, because you don't want to put mining machinery in a very hot, hostile environment. It's much easier if you can.
Yes, indeed.
400 or 500 degrees Celsius is not good for rubber or other components of most machines. So the resources that are inactive, as they've moved away from the hotspots, they have reached their maximum density of metal concentration. And they will also be much easier to mine with less risk to the machinery. But that then introduces a totally different type of biodiversity associated with that potential source of the resource.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. But that means out of the mining interest, if we talk about the genetic resources, the most interesting ones will be for the active chimneys, I imagine.
The extremophiles, yes, that's where the genetic pool is very, very specialised. It's evolved to a very specific set of environmental conditions.
Mm.
The biodiversity associated with what we call the inactive vent deposits is much more like a normal sort of seamount or ridge type of environment. That's where you get the attached corals and sponges and echinoderms, the sea stars, the sea urchins, a much more normal type of fauna and very different from that of the vents.
It is very interesting. So with all these different type of fauna, which have different specificities depending on, their location, when we talk about environmental impact, generally speaking, I imagine we're not talking only about exploitation, but we talk about also exploration impact on the marine environment.
Yes, we are. Any human activity in the deep ocean is basically going into an area that might not have been disturbed, even very much by nature in the past. When we talk about mining, we're not talking about exploration as such. Most nations and the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, is the same. It allows exploration under quite strict conditions. It limits the type of gear that you're able to use and the amount of disturbance that you're able to do. So exploration is very much a light touch designed solely to find out what is there and to collect baseline information. It then moves from that stage into starting to scale up the extent of disturbance, because while we might understand from exploration what we have there, what the biodiversity is looking like, what the composition and the structure of the communities and the ecosystem is like, what we don't know very, very well yet is what are the actual impacts of mining. We know what the impacts will be, but the nature and the scale of them is going to be very dependent upon the actual mining operation.
Of course, yeah.
And so that's where we move from this phase of exploration into an intermediate stage where there's testing of equipment or test mining, where small scale operations are carried out to enable us to learn a lot more about the actual nature of the impact, which can then be put into the environmental impact assessment of a full application for mining. We've got to understand before a mining license is granted what those impacts are going to be as the actual extent of disturbance and the source of the impacts are made more obvious, and that is where this test mining is important between exploration and exploitation.
Yes, it's interesting what you mentioned, because there's been test mining actually conducted through the exploration. I think for sure there was one, potentially a second one by China, if I remember recently, or it was planned to be done. And then in the draft exploitation codes, there will be, as it is drafted at the moment, it's not adopted. There's also a test mining phase in the exploitation before the full-scale exploitation could be done. So you have these sorts of intermediate phases that you mentioned in each of the, let's say, two big families, the exploration and the exploitation. So it's very interesting how much data is absolutely needed to be able to plan the activities, understand the impact, and keep on learning basically on depending on how much you scale up activities. Yeah,
but the important point you make there is we are continually learning. And it's interesting that test mining is an integral part of the exploration regulations. When they were drafted in the early 2000s, the intention was exploration would then move into test mining to give a full set of information on both the environmental baseline and its impacts and the impacts of the operation, to then be able to make an application for a mining license. But of course, going into test mining becomes hugely expensive.
Of course.
And now it's getting sort of rolled into being part of the exploitation regulations as well. There's a crossover But however it's handled, that intermediate stage, which even under exploration requires an environmental impact assessment. So it's a special type of case. Exploration activities, they can carry on as per normal, but if you're going to undertake testing of either a mining system or a major piece of equipment like a collector to pick up the nodules, that requires a specific environmental impact assessment, which is then reviewed by the International Seabed Authority, by the Legal and Technical Commission, before that activity is allowed to go ahead. So there's an added level of sort of checks and balances as we move from that basic exploration through to the component testing and the test mining stage, whether it be under exploration or exploitation.
And a lot of I will say companies actually conducting exploration at the moment haven't been doing actually test mining. Just a few of them have been doing it, and the others are keep on collecting a lot of data basically and renewing their exploration contracts.
That's right, yes. The end point that all these contractors have to head towards is if they want to get a mining license, they've got to put together a robust environmental impact assessment and an environmental management plan, which we'll talk about a bit later. And no contractor yet has really undertaken a serious test mining operation. They're testing collectors, so the technology required to extract the resource. They're testing the riser technology to get the mineral resource up to the surface of the seafloor of the sea where the vessels are. And the whole system in small scale, but nothing yet has really made enough of a disturbance to allow good predictions of what a full-scale mining operation might look like in terms of the nature and extent of the impact.
And what do we know actually at the moment about the main environmental impacts actually caused by deep-sea mining? Usually, I mean, in international law, we talk about, the different scope, the different dimension of the impact. You have the direct impact, the cumulative impact, the transboundary impact. Will there be more impacts to be discovered, I imagine? So maybe you can explain the main impacts actually we are aware of and concerned by, and what is expected actually to be discovered in the years to come.
Okay, the most obvious impacts are the direct physical ones. So it's where a machine is running over the seafloor. The design of that machine might vary between resources, the scraping, the grinding, the digging, but that's where there's the physical crushing or the breaking of animals which are living on the surface of the seabed, or compaction of the animals that are living underneath it. That's related quite strongly to the actual footprint of the mining machines. But there's a secondary source of impact, and that is that when these machines are running over the seabed, or the nodules are being picked up, whatever the technology used is, whether it's a dredging suction type thing or a physical removal like a dredge, there's going to be a sediment cloud produced. The deep sea floor, especially with the abyssal plains and the manganese, the polymetallic nodule resource, the nodules are embedded in an oozy type mud, and it gets resuspended very, very easily. And so that sediment plume can extend beyond the extent of the actual collector footprint. And that can have two effects. It's going to settle and potentially smother and bury animals close by the operation, or it's going to stay in a suspended form. And for a lot of animals which filter water to obtain their food, the suspension feeders, corals and sponges, for example, feeding mechanisms and breathing mechanisms can get clogged by this fine sediment. In the same way as we have trouble breathing if we're walking through ash or heavy fog or pollution. It's that same sort of effect, and that can extend much beyond the footprint, and it can also contain ecotoxins, so contaminants that might be released in association with the extraction of the minerals. It's particularly a case for seafloor massive sulfides, but even some of the nodule and cobalt-rich crust operations are likely to break up rocks or nodules and release some of the other contaminants which are contained within the resource.
Yeah, because for the crust, if I remember correctly, you need to have like a sort of explosion of the crust to actually extract the resources, the mineral resources. Is it correct?
That's one of the possibilities. Yes, yeah. Crust it's a very hard resource to imagine mining. It's a covering of the seamount, effectively. Mm-hmm. So it's blended into underlying non-crust. So you've got to actually physically remove quite a few centimetres of this high cobalt-rich part of the crust. So it's technologically quite an invasive and very demanding process compared with
nodules.
Compared with the concept of nodules, sitting like potatoes on the surface, which can be easily sucked up without having to really break up a very hard and
of course,
environment which has evolved over millions of years. Yeah. So you've got that sort of secondary effect which can extend much further than the footprint horizontally, but it also starts to affect the water column. That's where ocean currents it can come up a little bit, yes, depending on the particular nature of the environment in the location where that disturbance is happening. Mm-hmm. It's hard to generalise because the habitats, the environments are so variable that what might happen in one part of the ocean might not happen in another. The type of machinery and the actual small-scale topography of the seabed can have quite an influence on what happens to that sediment. But you've got the water column to consider, as well as the more extensive horizontal extent by sediment and associated dispersal. And as you note, some of those impacts might not operate in isolation. In fact, it's highly likely that they won't. There's quite a mixture of impact being applied to seabed communities, and different animals will respond in different ways to those impacts. But often they can be additive. So you could add burial, which might make an animal feel a little bit unhealthy, and if it's feeding from the water column as well, you're adding a suspended sediment cloud, which may have some toxic chemicals in it as well. So there's a strong possibility there will be additive effects. We call them cumulative impacts, which need to be assessed, where they add onto one another. There can also be some cancelling out of impacts, perhaps. Certainly, different chemicals operate in different ways, and some might reduce the impacts of others. It requires a lot of quite specific understanding of the actual location in which mining is going to take place and the specific environmental conditions that are there, and hence what impacts will result.
Of course, and there might be, I mean, I know we're going to talk about it later, but there needs to be also a lot of planning of ocean activities, because mining is not the only exploration or research or even mining later will not be the only activity actually in specific locations. You can have fishing activities, you can have navigation. I mean, you can have plenty of different activities that can take place in an environment that is constantly, kind of evolving together. So imagine in terms of impact, that makes things also even more complicated to be able to figure out, through these different planning of activities, what will be the impact, throughout the water column and the seabed.
Yes, and while you don't require environmental impact assessments for established fisheries or for navigational routes or for cable laying, they're definitely going to be required, and very seriously, for seabed mining. And those mining applications are going to have to take into account all these other activities that are going on as well, to ensure that the mining activity can work in with other sectors and with other uses of the space.
Yeah, so it's very complex. What type of impacts do you think might be discovered? You mentioned before the importance of the test mining in terms of, collecting new data, testing equipment. I guess it's also, as you mentioned, to actually understand better the impacts depending on, the testing that is being done and the scale that is being done also.
Yes. What I've described and what we do know a lot about is what are the most likely sources of impact. So we know that there's going to be the physical disturbance. That's the easiest one to allow for because we know what the footprint of a mining operation is going to look like. Mm-hmm. But the extent of dispersal of a sediment plume or the area over which it settles at a certain depth, which can affect animals, we don't really know that until we get into this sort of test mining phase where we can actually see what a serious mining operation is going to do. Mm-hmm. Another key gap, we know the riser going from, in case of nodules, 5 or 6 kilometres right up to the surface. That's going to be bringing up nodules, rocks, sediment. It's going to be a very noisy environment with pumps along the way to help get that slurry up to the vessel for processing. We know very little the frequencies of that noise, the range over which they might extend. And noise obviously has quite an impact on marine life as well. It's well known for marine mammals, for example. It will affect their behaviour and their ability to communicate and to hear. So there are bound to be things that, it's going to be a combination of things that we don't know about, mm-hmm. in particular the way impacts might combine, but also until we actually undertake some of this test mining and the systems are well developed and well monitored, we don't actually know the scale of that impact and what its consequences might be. So that's again a reason why this test mining phase is going to be a really important intermediate step between exploration and full exploitation.
Do you expect more test mining happening in the years to come, or do you think it's going to take time because a lot of exploration contracts are, getting renewed? Potentially they're not ready yet for test mining. What do you think?
Well, I think firstly, test mining has to happen for any application for mining to be successful. Otherwise, there will be too much uncertainty. And as we'll discuss later, uncertainty is something we can try and manage. I mean, humans are pretty good at not knowing enough before they start. But in this case, hopefully we're able to put enough checks and balances in to learn as we go. But as I said, we'll come back to that. But an issue with test mining will be how transferable it is between contractors. As you noted before, a few contractors are undertaking collector testing, and that will hopefully be followed up by systems testing and test mining. Mm-hmm. How much of what is done by one contractor on one resource can be applied to another contractor on the same resource in a different area? Mm-hmm. We don't know yet. That would be an important element of understanding how much we need to reinvent the wheel, or how much we can learn from what's already been done, and ultimately the test mining in one location, how much it will need to be sort of interpreted in a slightly different way given a set of slightly different environmental conditions in another location. So there is going to be the opportunity to learn from what other contractors have done, but there's no escaping the need to ensure that the results that are being applied from another contractor are in fact applicable.
Of course.
We can't just make the assumption that, yes, because contractor A found this, it's going to be the same finding in another area. And certainly as we change resources from polymetallic nodules to cobalt crust to sulfides, they're going to require very different types of assessments.
Of course. It's so interesting. So if we dive now a bit more into the main scientific challenges, could you explain actually, you've been actually mentioning 3 main scientific challenges in your chapter: limited scientific data and knowledge, the ecosystem approach, and as you mentioned, dealing with uncertainty. Can you please explain a bit the 3 main scientific challenges and basically what they encompass in terms of mining and scientific challenges? Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'll try and do this in a concise and reasonably brief manner.
We can start with the limited scientific data and knowledge.
Yes.
We usually hear when we work in ocean data that there's always an issue with baseline that you mentioned, but also question of quality, standardization, analysis of this data. You can have a lot of data, but you need to have a good quality. You need to be able to compare it. You need to process it. So maybe this will be really interesting. And also what you mentioned, the issue of the quantification of the impacts. How do we basically can quantify an impact to be serious or not serious or harmful, or how do you do that actually with limited scientific data and knowledge?
Right. Yeah. Well, firstly, now that we're getting into the chapter of the book, I really would like to take this opportunity to express my deepest sympathies and condolences at the untimely passing of a co-author of this chapter, and a very close colleague and a friend, Harold Brecker. He's sorely missed, and his contribution to this chapter was a very important one. But focusing on these three key challenges and starting with the limited scientific data and knowledge, when you look at things we don't know about the deep sea, and this comes back to the complexity of the deep sea environments that we were talking about before, we could write a whole book on what we don't know. But if we sort of just sit there thinking, gosh, we'd like to know everything about something before we do anything with it or about it, then we do nothing.
It's impossible. And we will always learn something new, of course.
That's right. Things are always changing in space and time. So what we've tried to do in this chapter is focus on some fundamental challenges that can be improved and offer a way forward in a way that we can hopefully learn as we go, but not sort of get stuck trying to get to first base because we don't quite know where we're going. So we're not proposing ways around some of these challenges and limitations as being a silver bullet, but in this chapter we offer some suggestions about how we can maybe just rethink and simplify a little bit our approach to some of the information needs for seabed mining, focus them, structure them, so that we can move forward in a well-considered and precautionary way. So this limited scientific data and knowledge, we all hear every day about how many more species are found every time a deep sea expedition occurs. And that's all very well. We're still finding new species on land as well after centuries of exploration. So it goes without saying that our knowledge of biodiversity will always increase. But does that mean we need to know everything and to have sampled everything before we can move forward? And I'm suggesting we don't necessarily need to try and do everything. If we can be a little bit more strategic in what we need to provide for an adequate environmental impact assessment and management plan, to actually focus on the end point of where a mining operation would want to be and what it needs to ensure the managers, the regulators and the public that what it's doing is going to be sustainable and not cause a risk to the environment. And what I've seen over the years is that right at the start, there's this sort of plan to sample everything and we'll worry about what we focus on later on. But hopefully from what we've talked about already, some of the characteristics we know about the deep sea environment, some of the key sources of impact, we can actually focus some of our scientific studies a lot more than needing to go out and try and measure everything.
Yeah.
And key to that, right at the beginning, is to undertake an environmental risk assessment. This will highlight areas of greatest risk from impacts of current or proposed human activities. And this means we can prioritise that baseline data collection and focus on the most important interactions and the areas of greatest uncertainty. So that will help ensure the science is relevant, and then we're not spending a lot of scarce resource and effort on things that might be nice to know, but we don't really need to know, and that are maximised to support the future environmental impact assessment process. And in saying that, I should stress that the environmental impact assessment is a very serious process. The level of proof has got to be pretty high for a regulator, especially in the high seas, where we're dealing with the common heritage of humankind. We've got to make sure there's a controlled and acceptable level of risk to that environment. So we're not just casually saying, oh yeah, we'll do an ERA and we'll be fine. But it's a way of trying to maximise the benefit of the scientific studies that are done.
Yeah. You see this ambition and this level of expectation. You see it actually in the draft exploitation code that is getting very, very precise about, certain type of impacts, and you see like such a change of generation between the exploration and the exploitation codes. I think it's really translating your concern about how to manage and preserve the common heritage of mankind. It's fascinating how it's been evolving actually through the years.
It is, and it is embodied in the draft exploitation regulations, which is not surprising because they were generated by the Legal and Technical Commission, which was using a lot of experience with the exploration regs. Yeah. But that risk assessment and the linkage with EIA and the environmental impact assessment and environmental management and monitoring planning parts of the process are not well embodied in the exploration regulations.
Yeah, it's true.
And that's really where this risk assessment needs to take place, because the environmental baseline data are coming primarily from the exploration phase. Yeah. So that's what's got to be structured. It's a bit late to be applying for an exploitation license and trying to fill all these gaps.
Of course.
The gaps should be filled before you're able to confidently put together a robust EIA and EMMP. Yeah. So at the moment, it's a little bit of the cart before the horse. That risk assessment is a precursor to developing a program that's going to provide the required information for the EIA and the EMMP parts of the application for actual mining. It's the sort of thing that's done as standard with oil and gas and with developing new fisheries now, but we haven't really seen it really taken on board by contractors right at the outset of their exploration activities for deep seabed mining, and hopefully it's something that will mature. But a lot of those exploration contracts have been going for decades, and they're still struggling to get together a robust set of environmental baseline data that are going to be most appropriate for supporting the needs of the impact assessment.
Yeah, and I know the Legal and Technical Commission has been actually highlighting a couple of times the fact that contractors need to, be more consistent and thorough in the baseline data they're actually collecting, and deal with the issue of quality, standardization. What you mentioned actually in the chapter, it's not only in the future, but also it's in the present. These are present and future challenges at the same time.
There have been considerable efforts to try and improve that element of standardisation going back to the early 2000s. And there are quite a few documents, and most of the contractors now are following guidance from the Commission, which is focused on trying to improve that level of standardisation and hence the comparability of information collected by one contractor with another. And that also benefits the contractor a lot, because they can start to put their own activities, their own baseline data in a broader regional context to know whether their area is very similar to other areas or whether it's quite different and has some specific characteristics. Yeah. So it's a win-win. It's required by the ISA to understand the regional context of a particular mining operation, and it can also help ensure that management measures by an individual contractor or by the ISA in the case of a regional environmental management plan, are appropriate to help ensure and give us confidence that the biodiversity and the ecosystem structure and function is preserved at a regional scale.
Yeah.
Because that's the important thing. We want to make sure that ecosystems are not affected.
And I guess from the point of view of the ISA, it makes it even more interesting because then you're able to navigate between the data of the different contractors and potentially spot inconsistencies or, issues, similarities. So for you, there's a lot of learning you can do from the ability to navigate all the data that is being given to the ISA. And also later to the deep data, actually, framework, because all the environmental data, used for the protection of the marine environments, is actually to be released through the deep data platform. So it means that this data could be used by, other type of actors, researchers, companies. So I imagine that's why also there's a great need of having this quality and this standardization also to make sure the data could be reusable.
Yes, it's a good point you raised, because I was going to mention deep data myself, and that is for those that don't know, a database which includes all the contractor environmental data. And a requirement of any database, of course, is that there are templates and the data are submitted in a form that is consistent with the database structure and format. So that has coincided with the development of further recommendations by the Commission in the late 2019s to try and improve standardisation, get the data in a consistent format, and then it can be populated into deep data, which it is now doing. There are standard ISA templates that need to be submitted each year, and it's a great resource, but it needs a little bit more work yet. It's, as you can imagine, the volume and complexity of data as exploration continues is huge. Yes. It's a real challenge for any database to be a one-stop shop and all singing, all dancing repository of data that can be used by anybody for any non-confidential reasons. But it is a huge resource for pulling together and analysing multiple sets of environmental data across a region.
Let's dive a bit more into what you mentioned about the ecosystem approach. Can you explain what are the challenges linked to the implementation of the ecosystem approach?
Right. Yeah, well, the ecosystem approach, we hear an awful lot about it. It's embedded in almost every set of environmental legislation, whether it's national or international.
It's a great concept, but usually it's quite, I would say, it's not really implemented in an effective way, I will say. I think it's a good ambition, but sometimes it lacks teeth, or tools to be able to do it. So
yeah, well, from a scientific perspective, it's a really great concept, but a very difficult one to put into operation. So an ecosystem is really where we're getting away from looking at individual parts of a system, individual communities. We start combining the various types of seafloor benthic animals with the midwater, the pelagic animals. So we try and look at the whole system. But of course, animals differ. They vary in their distribution, their abundance patterns. So where this system, which we call the ecosystem, stops and finishes is very difficult to establish, especially when you've got wide open ocean spaces over hundreds of thousands of kilometres and multiple kilometres in depth, all differing in their environmental characteristics. So it's a hard one to grapple with, but we don't necessarily need to go into having to have a box saying this is our ecosystem. What we try and advance in this section of it is that we're moving away from the need to examine every species, to identify every species and base everything on high resolution identification of individual animals. What's important is that we've got a layering of this concept of an ecosystem from its composition, that is what animals are there, how they're structured in terms of what's abundant, what's not, and in particular how they interact. And that's where we start getting up away from just the structure into the function. So how do the roles that individual animals perform work together? What can make them successful and what can make them not? It's a little bit like if we take a census of a town and we just look at the number of people, their gender, their nationality. That tells us about the composition of the town, but it tells us nothing about what makes that town work. For that, we've got to know, right, have we got a mixture of farmers, factories, grocery stores, banks? All of those things interact. And that's really important that it's that function, the thing that makes the town work. That's what we don't want to disrupt by seabed mining. We might lose the odd person or two, but as long as we're sure that there's enough redundancy there to ensure that the town can still function, then we can start to evaluate that we're not going to create a serious impact on the environment with long-term consequences that we might not be able to rectify. And we can start to evaluate, well, what level of risk is acceptable? We know there's an impact from mining. If we want those metals, then we've got to extract the minerals and there's got to be an environmental cost. But what's acceptable? And we can look at it, as we suggest in the chapter, from looking at the functional end of things to make sure that we've got to maintain the way the ecosystem sort of operates, the way it works, and ensure that some key linkages in that are not disrupted.
Yeah.
That gives us the ability to know if there's a certain impact which affects a certain type of animal which is undertaking a particular function, then we know how that relates and how that could trickle down to impacts on other animals which aren't directly affected.
It goes back to the priority idea you were mentioning before, because I wanted to quote one of your sentences that I really love. Walter told me that you wrote this sentence, so I'm just quoting it. For many habitats, science is still at the stage of describing ecosystem structure rather than understanding function, and unable to estimate ecological thresholds for use in decision making. So it's exactly this that you were saying. It's basically, for the ecosystem approach, we need to move beyond just the description and basically putting categories and describing species, doing taxonomy, and then diving into understanding the function of ecosystems to be able really to apply this ecosystem approach.
Yes. It's exactly what I've just described. What we really want to preserve is ensuring that the linkages to make that town, the ecosystem, still function, even though we're disturbing it in a certain way.
Yeah.
We're not affecting those key linkages which could cause major ecological change and a regime shift. There's no argument that certain species level knowledge is still important for baseline inventories, especially if we've got animals which are only found in a certain location, because we don't want to knowingly wipe out species. So there's still a need for some detailed research, but it's unrealistic to gather enough information on everything. So what we're suggesting here is we start to look a lot more at pulling together what animals we can, and in particular their feeding mode is an important one, what we call an ecological trait. We can start to bundle species and taxa together into functional groupings, and that's what we're suggesting here, that should become more of a priority for research than necessarily, no disrespect to taxonomists, but going out there and describing new species.
Sure.
Again, keeping in mind we're doing this research in support of potential seabed mining. So that's why there's the need to, if we can focus the research and look at this bigger picture linkage type of methodology and framework, I think we can get to first base and move on and hopefully carry that momentum forward to improve our understanding as we start to enter mining.
And when you were mentioning the third challenge, which is dealing with uncertainty, as we mentioned at the beginning actually of the discussion, of course, there's always going to be uncertainty because there's always things that we don't know and that we're going to discover, and conditions and time are changing, and the ecosystems are changing, the earth is changing, is not static. And since we're always dealing with uncertainty, what is actually the challenge dealing with uncertainty?
Well, the challenge here is that we know it's there, whether it's uncertainty in our knowledge, the extent of our knowledge, or the measurements that we're making of certain components of the ecosystem. And something that's mentioned quite a lot to get past this roadblock of uncertainty, with people saying, gosh, we don't know what the impact of that uncertainty is. There's a developing discipline to try and address that by learning as we go. It's called adaptive management. And this came from the fisheries literature back in the 1960s. And back then it was almost a trial and error. We'll see what happens when we do something. Adaptive management has moved on a lot since then, and what would need to be applied in a seabed mining situation is taking adaptive management as a structured learning process. So it's where you accept you don't know certain things, but you know which of those things it's important to know about. So you can structure a monitoring program that as you start to exploit the resource, or as you start to undertake test mining, you're focusing your monitoring program on the things that you want to learn about, the things that could be a real red light for a full-scale mining operation. It's got to be a structured way. As I said, it's not a trial and error. You've got different views of the world. You might say, if our understanding is good enough, we will expect our monitoring to result in these changes as we start to mine.
Yeah.
But often those expectations aren't right. Some of our assumptions might be wrong and will deviate. So part of this adaptive management is to have several views of the world. You know what you want to learn about to satisfy the main areas of uncertainty, or where you think the main impacts could be, so that you've really got to manage those. And you learn as you go. You know that if you're starting to deviate and you've got certain models that are structured that also perform like that, you can understand what's causing that deviation from the path that you expect.
Yeah.
And you can then correct.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it gets too bad, you stop the operation. You're saying, hey, no, we don't know enough. We can't manage this uncertainty.
I think it's very important what you mentioned, because I can always already imagine people jumping on their seat saying, adaptive management is not good for the environment because then they can just do whatever they want. I think we need to clarify here that it's within the scope, of course, of the precautionary approach. So there's always like these kind of compass of, the environmental objectives, the objectives of the operations, and basically the way to navigate between, how to mitigate, how to reduce the risk, and to be able to adapt the activities means that you need to learn from the activities themselves as well. Because the mitigation is always coming from, not, theoretical data. You need actually to retrieve information, like you mentioned in the test mining, to test certain things, small scale, bigger scale, understand how the environment is reacting, how the contractors can handle things. And so that's the whole, just to understand if I understand it correctly as well, that's the whole process of adaptive management, to be able to use all of these actually tools to be able really to adapt.
Yes. And as you said, people can think, adaptive management will just let the contractors measure what's changing and carry on. That's not what adaptive management is all about. That's the trial and error approach. Yeah. What we're talking about in this context is a very structured, and it's a decision-making process. It's got quite a prescriptive recipe if it's going to be done properly, and the process can be checked against those components that it's got to have. Things like objectives from the outset. There's a lot of monitoring. You've got to have several different models of the world that we've talked about, so that if something starts to deviate, you don't just wonder, why is it doing that? You've got an understanding of what might be driving that, and you've got decision rules as to when you stop. You don't just keep on going. You've got associated reference points where you say, okay, this needs a correction to what we're doing. or if we don't know what the answer is, then we stop. So it's not a get out of jail free card by saying I'm going to do adaptive management. It's a major undertaking, and it's not just a bunch of scientists doing it. It's very much a participatory, stakeholder-driven exercise, because everybody's got to have confidence in it. The regulators and society are comfortable that those checks and balances are in place. And it's also got to be consistent with the laws, whether it's national or international, because it's got to be consistent with that legislative umbrella under which all seabed mining would take place.
I think what you mentioned, it's something that I've raised actually in the introduction. It's, since we're talking about the common heritage of mankind, I think what we see at the ISA, it's really the challenge of, you know, the social license to operate, like the understanding and the support of the society, whatever the decision is made and how the decision will be made. And I think this component is very important. And with the adaptive management, I think it's very important because there's so many stakeholders actually in the chain of, you know, exploration and exploitation. It's not just, you know, the state and the ISA and the contractor. You have a lot of expertise, you have a lot of consultation to be made. There's a lot of scientists that are involved. So the you know, this chain of stakeholders within the adaptive management, I find it very interesting actually.
Yeah, well, I guess when we look at those three sort of challenges together, which we've isolated, they might sound very simplistic. We all know the amount of science that needs to underpin each of those, but what we're hoping here is that we can get over that data limitation issue to some extent by that risk assessment, by focusing the efforts. And then we're moving on to, well, what is our knowledge base going to look like, and what's good enough? And that's where, if we can get our head out of the trees a little bit, not get lost in the forest by its complexity or its density, but look at the shape of the forest as a whole, that's the ecosystem type approach, then we're keeping our eye on what we need to manage. It's not the individual trees so much, it's the overall health of the forest. And then, because we still don't know, we will never know enough before we actually start. Hopefully this adaptive management framework can give us a way of, in a structured and precautionary way, moving forward.
Yeah.
So hopefully that makes sense to people listening to this cast, that we're simplifying things down to just three challenges when people could write a book on the challenges.
Yeah, for sure.
But we're trying to focus on something that's tractable and simple enough to actually be manageable and move forward.
Maybe we can end this discussion with another difficult topic we could talk about, you know, for hours. It's actually what's happening at the end of the exploitation. So we see it in the draft exploitation codes that there's been. So I'm cautious because it's not adopted, but we're talking about restoration and rehabilitation of the mining site. So we see that there's different type of, I will say, environmental concern that are actually inserted into, you know, all the different type of activities that could be conducted on the deep sea bed. What is it actually, restoration and rehabilitation, and what will it take in terms of knowledge and technology to do that effectively, actually? Personally, I find it very ambitious but very complex also, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of things we don't know. So I wanted to have your candid views.
Okay. You talk about it's ambitious and it's complex.
Mm-hmm.
My candid view is we've got to look very carefully at how realistic it is. So it's part of what is termed the mitigation hierarchy, which is a standard management approach where you've got impacts. Your first stop is to see, well, can we avoid it? Can we shift the location of something to avoid the impacts that we didn't like, or that we're going to predict would occur? And if you can't avoid it, and seabed mining is seabed mining, so if it's going to go ahead, it's going to have an impact. So then you move into this minimise stage, where you try and reduce the level of that impact completely. or as much as you can, by changing your gear type to have less impact, or to mine in strips rather than mowing the entire lawn. You can do things like that to reduce the level of impact. After that, you're getting into, well, we've got an impact, it's residual. And often you then look at this restoration, rehabilitation stage. And with mineral resources, it's really, really hard to understand how feasible that might be. Yeah. We know that the polymetallic nodules, which host a certain type of specialised fauna, take millions of years to form. We can't put back grown manganese nodules to replace what's being taken out. There's been talk of putting down concrete ones, but are we adding another environmental hazard to that type of environment? So I think we've got to look very carefully at the timescale of any proper restoration. And I think restoration really going back to the geological formation of these, whether it's crust on seamounts or massive sulfides which might have accumulated from chimneys, or the polymetallic nodule fields, restoration is not really a feasible option. Rehabilitation is what you see more commonly on land, where a mine ends up being rehabilitated. It's not restored, but you might have a nice lake with plantings around it and a forest growing. It looks great, and people think, yeah, that's a nice result from what used to be a horrible open cast mine.
But it's not a return to the natural state, let's say. It's completely different. Yep.
That's right. It's that restoration versus rehabilitation. Rehabilitation just sort of makes it look good again, or takes away the eyesore. What does that look like in the deep ocean when you've got the nodule fields removed, and what's been left behind is the standard sort of abyssal plain type sandy, muddy ooze environment. You haven't killed the environment completely. You've changed it. But I think, without getting into ways of whether that's good or not, an important component of it is, can we actually address that issue of not having to restore? The rehabilitation, we can sort of modify that a little bit to get back to an environment which is still usable by deep sea animals. If we sort of look at it from a different angle of saying that mining is going to impact a certain type of environment over a certain scale, can we ensure before that mining operation starts, we've got similar areas protected? So that we're protecting areas which were not going to be impacted by mining or hopefully other activities at all. And that's safeguarding the ecosystem structure and function over hopefully the area which includes the altered habitat by a mining operation. So that ensures, if it's applied early, we've got this precautionary conservation, which is almost ensuring we've got enough protected so we don't have to worry about restoration to maintain the ecosystem function. And this spatial management with areas protected and structured by an objective network design criteria framework is already pretty common in national jurisdictions. And we're seeing it also now in developing International Seabed Authority environmental management plans, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, and the developing ones for the Northwest Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So that sort of, in a way, reduces the requirement, I think, if it's done properly, from having to restore or rehabilitate, or at least it goes into the mix of the management plan components to ensure that we don't disrupt that ecosystem function by any individual or cumulative mining operations.
What I've been worried about, but it's really my personal views when I studied actually the draft exploitation codes, and so the importance actually given to restoration and rehabilitation is not the objectives. I think the objectives are good. But I was actually worried about the timescale, so on the point of view of the contractor, after the exploitation, how much time they will need to get involved to be able to reach these objectives of rehabilitation and restoration. We're talking about a lot of years, because I think it's quite complex. We still need to have a lot of, as you say, knowledge, not about the description of the ecosystem, but also their functioning to be able to do that as well. We
Yeah.
come back to the same.
Well, if we look at the overall goals of UNCLOS, so we're balancing potential exploitation with the maintenance of the avoidance of significant harm or harmful effects to the environment. Mining is going to create some harmful effects, but the issue is, can we manage the nature and the scale of them so we ensure that ecosystem function and hopefully structure and composition as well is not impacted in any way which causes a major shift, an undesirable shift from what's acceptable to society.
Yeah.
And in that regard, spatial management, non-spatial management, restoration, rehabilitation, they're all potential tools in the manager's toolbox to meet that objective. And what I'm suggesting is, if restoration or rehabilitation is not likely to be feasible or realistic, can we do without it? Can we apply other management techniques from that toolbox that ensure that the goal and the objectives of the management are met? We don't need to necessarily do the same thing every time, or to have all components, especially if in the deep sea one has to question how feasible, and in particular the time frame, how realistic that is to achieve some of those objectives if we want to try and somehow restore the environment to what was there originally, which is getting into geological timeframes, not human management or lifetime timeframes.
Yeah, so interesting. Well, Malcolm, so much for this fantastic discussion. I think we could keep on going, but but we need to stop at some stage. I found it really, really interesting, and I hope everyone listening actually to the episode will be learning a lot of new things and will actually help clarify, things they've heard but actually didn't really understand the scale or the scope or the complexity. So many, many thanks, Malcolm, for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Virginie. It's been my pleasure, and I apologise if I've taken longer verbally to explain some things than people might take to read the chapter. But I would just make one final comment, if I may, which I think has already come out in the discussion of how throughout each of these challenges we've stressed the linkage between science and management. And that, I think, is an important aspect for all the scientists involved in this whole area of potential seabed mining and in deep sea research, to keep in mind that the role of science is to inform. It's not to make decisions on policy or management. And to be effective, I personally believe very strongly that it requires very close interaction and engagement with the regulators, the managers, and the policymakers. We see a lot of really good science published in scientific journals, which doesn't make it through. It's not packaged in the right way to be picked up by managers and put into an operational, or
translated in their own way of thinking.
It requires the scientists to work with other people, and in particular in the International Seabed Authority space, we've seen some really good outcomes happen very quickly when the science has been part of the regulatory processes, in particular with the regional environmental management planning processes, for example. It's where we're looking at that combination of environmental, economic and societal components as a package, where the science is fundamental to it, but it's integrated with it so that right from the outset it fits in, it slots in, to ensure that we're not spending time arguing about how a particular paper fits in or what it means for developing management plans.
It's so interesting because, everything we talked about, and I mean, what you mentioned with, the issue of science and the relationship between science and management. I mean, you know more than me, there's a lot of issues also in fisheries management. So we could have like another conversation about, how you reconcile science management, the economic drivers behind fisheries, and the environmental dimension of fisheries. There's a lot of work to be done also in this. So it's interesting for the audience also to understand that you have like cross-cutting issues, not between deep sea mining, but also more traditional activities that are posing a lot of challenges at the moment. So yeah, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, that's a very good point to end on. I think that, yeah, humans are part of the ecosystem as well. And I think no matter what part of life we come from, whether we're a scientist or a manager or the public, yeah, we're all trying to see a balance where humans can receive some of the services from the deep sea that we enjoy, but we balance that with adequate conservation to ensure that we don't make unforeseen mistakes, or we can balance that exploitation with conservation.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Malcolm. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to other discussions. Thank you very much.
Okay, au revoir.